All right, hi, and welcome to day two of Empower Missouri's Week of Action. My name is Lucas Caldwell McMillan. I'm glad you're here. I'm Chief of Policy Staff and work with the policy team here at Empower Missouri. If you were here with us yesterday, I just want to let you all know we had over 400 messages sent to legislators in Jefferson City to support expanding access to food through a Food is Medicine program and establishing and supporting the Food is Medicine Act yesterday through a great event. Glad you're here today. We'll hear from our community justice team in a moment. If you're able to join us for our final event, which is tomorrow, same time, same place, we'll learn more about the Missouri Housing Trust Fund and bills that will triple the funding for this affordable housing pot of money in Missouri called the Missouri Housing Trust Fund. And we'll hear from our affordable housing team tomorrow. But today on day two, we're here to talk about sentencing reform and not wasting money on building more prisons. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Gwen Smith Moore, who's a community justice policy manager with Empower Missouri, and she's going to take us through today's program. Gwen?
Thank you so much, Lucas. And hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for our second day in our week of action. Just to start out with laying out the agenda for the next hour. To start out with, I'm going to walk us through Missouri's current sentencing policy. Try not to get too in the weeds, but I do think it's important to kind of understand what laws we already have on the books here, what those sentencing structures look like. And then we will dive into why why mandatory minimums are regressive sentencing policy, look at some of the myths versus the facts on mandatory minimums. We will look at filed legislation in 2026 around increased prison sentences and mandatory minimums. Then I will turn it over to Matthew Charles with FAM. We'll hear a little bit about Matthew's story and advocacy fighting against mandatory minimums, both in Missouri and nationally. And then I will wrap us up with a call to action, contacting members of the House Judiciary Committee to let them know your opinion about the mandatory minimum bills that are being heard there. And end on a positive note of sharing a couple of the sentencing reform bills that have been filed this year, things that we should be doing instead of increasing prison sentences. All right. So just want to start with kind of a bird's eye view of the issue. So what are mandatory minimums? They have been around for many decades now, since the onset of mass incarceration. These have been a controversial sentencing structure that put more people behind bars for longer. Proponents of mandatory minimums say that they promote truth in sentencing. Or I just heard this last week in the House Judiciary Committee hearing on a mandatory minimum bill. The bill sponsor used the term transparency in sentencing. So proponents say we need to know, when somebody is sentenced, exactly how much time they're going to be serving, so we can tell that to the victim, we can tell that to other impacted individuals. That's why we need this type of bill. We will look at those arguments and some other kind of things that are behind the push for mandatory minimums. But as always, I think when we think about these really big policies and when we're talking about more Missourians being incarcerated for longer, it's very important that we keep at the forefront of our minds who is benefiting from longer sentences. And this is not a complete list by any means, but just a couple kind of key players to keep in mind. There are many companies that have a vested interest in Missouri prison populations, the so-called prison industrial complex. These are the many different private contractors from Centurion that handles Missouri's severely lacking medical care system in our state prisons, to JPay, who's behind the tablets, to I think it's Keefe Industries is behind the food that's sold in canteens in Missouri prisons. So there's a lot of companies that are making money on Missouri prisons. Politicians that have really leaned into tough on crime messaging benefit from longer sentencing. They tell their constituents this is what they're going after. And when these types of bills pass, when people are being sent to prison for longer, that's a benefit for them. And then the economies of prison towns. And I said this is debatable because I think could have a much bigger conversation here on if, that is really positive economic impact for some of these towns. There's a lot of detrimental impacts as well, but the fact is there are many towns throughout our state who, one of the biggest employers and biggest kind of economic engines is the prison in that town. Who's harmed by longer sentences? Obviously, incarcerated individuals themselves, but there's disproportionate impacts here. Young people are going to be impacted more. People with mental health and substance use disorders are typically impacted more, and Black defendants are disproportionately impacted, which we'll look at in just a couple slides. Families and communities, both of incarcerated individuals and the families and communities of prison staff. The Department of Corrections and prison staff as well are harmed by longer sentences. We know that Missouri prisons are already severely understaffed, already struggling with a lot of issues. So adding at all to the prison population is going to be a detrimental impact across the board. Next, again, just going to walk us through a little bit of our current sentencing policy. So what is a sentence? A sentence is an official punishment that's handed down by a judge to somebody that's been convicted of a crime. Mandatory minimum sentences are those that are outlined by statute, and they require that somebody convicted of a crime serve a sentence of a specific length before, excuse me, before being eligible for parole or release. Next slide, Lucas. This is a helpful graphic from our partners at Prison Policy Initiative that shows how many of our residents in Missouri are locked up in prisons, approximately 23,000. My apologies, folks. I'm going to grab a cough drop. I'm dealing with a little cough right now. You can go to the next slide, Lucas. Missouri's incarceration rate, when placed in a national context, is really just, or in an international context, really, I think just really drives home the point that what we do here is not normal. This is not the way that things need to be done. This is not the only way to have a criminal legal system or to respond to crime and criminal offenders. There are many other ways to approach it. Sometimes I think that we think the way that we do things is the way that we need to continue to do them. But you can see that, Missouri not only outpaces the United States, we outpace every other country in NATO. The US, of course, being far and away the biggest incarcerator by country rate, but Missouri outpacing even the US nationally. The racial disparities in our prison population, I think also just really can't be understated. This is just a fundamental core issue when we talk about prisons in Missouri. The incarceration rate for Black Missourians is over 3 times that for white Missourians. So the impacts that we're talking about when we talk about expanded prison sentences, those impacts are going to be felt in particular by Black communities. Okay, so current law in Missouri, again, I don't want to get too into the weeds, so I will try to keep this a pretty top level summary. But we do have certain sentence enhancements already on the books. There are enhanced punishments for defendants that have committed prior felonies, and then also for certain violent or dangerous offenses. So a persistent offender is defined as someone that's been found guilty of 2 or more felonies committed at different times, or this is new from 2024, someone that was previously found guilty of 1 dangerous felony. So there's a lot of ways that the net for who sentencing enhancements apply to, who the minimum prison term structure applies to, ways in which that net gets widened. And those, it doesn't take a totally new, comprehensive new sentencing structure for more people to be in that net. And so the 2024 Omnibus Bill is a great example um, that, they just opened up this definition a little bit more. So folks that have been previously found guilty of one dangerous felony now meet the persistent offender definition. A dangerous offender is somebody that's pretty broad definition. If you're guilty of a class A or B felony, which are the most serious classes of felonies, or a dangerous felony is defined by statute. It's a very specific list of felonies. And during the commission of the offense, you endangered or threatened harm. And that is very broadly defined, and so could be taken to mean many things. So if you're found to be a persistent or a dangerous offender, you are subject to one whole punishment range higher. So say you've been charged with a Class C felony, which carries a sentence length of 3 to 10 years, but one of these definitions applies to you, you would instead be subject to the Class B range of punishment, so 5 to 15 years. Next slide, thank you. The minimum prison term structure as it stands right now in Missouri is primarily focused on individuals that have prior prison commitments in the Department of Corrections, people that have been in prison custody before. If you've had one prior prison commitment to the DOC, you have to serve at least 40% of the sentence. There's different laws or a different statute here for folks that reach 70 years of age if they've served at least 30% of the sentence. 2 prior prison commitments, that number goes up to 50%. 3 or more prior prison commitments, that number goes up to 80%. And then dangerous felonies, which, as I mentioned, are outlined in statute, and it's a very specific list of felonies, violent felonies, you have to serve 85% of your sentence. This whole chart also only applies to a limited list of felonies. It's not every single felony that this applies to, and we'll talk about that in a little bit because some of the bills would drastically change that approach. Next slide, please. So what does all of this actually mean for the prison population? In Missouri, every year, about 3,000 people that are admitted to Missouri prisons are admitted with these minimum prison term sentences. That's about a third of annual new sentence admissions. Longer sentences increase prison populations and cost. The longer folks are incarcerated, the more medical costs are going to be, the harder time they are going to have when it comes time to be prepared for release and reintegration back into society. All of the impacts of incarceration are exacerbated by time. So the longer time that you spend in prison, away from your family, away from your community of origin, the more intense those negative impacts become. Outside of Medicaid, we know that prison costs are the second fastest growing area of state budgets. And prisons cost most states almost 5 times more today than they did in the mid-1980s, due to having to house and feed people for much longer periods of time. And of course, the carceral situation that we have now kind of originated back in the 1980s, right? We started doing sentencing policy and an approach to prisons and who should be incarcerated and for how long, very differently than we had done prior to that. And now, several decades in, it's very clear that the system is unsustainable, and that we should be moving back. We should be considering different pathways and alternatives rather than continuing to put our foot on the gas pedal and double down on regressive sentencing policy. The annual cost of incarceration per individual has increased a lot in the last 10 years. So in 2015, the annual cost to incarcerate a person in Missouri was a little over 22,000. Um, this number comes directly from the DOC in a fiscal impact statement on one of these mandatory minimum bills. The current cost is estimated at 39,000 per year, or almost $107 per day per individual. There's a lot of reasons that those costs have gone up, but one of the reasons is that folks are serving longer sentences, and folks are aging in prison, and that comes with a lot of associated extra expenses. Next slide. Thanks, Lucas. All right. So what do we mean when we say that mandatory minimums are regressive sentencing policy? Um, kind of exactly what I was just saying. This is really a move backwards, that would take us, back into the era when people were really doubling down on three strikes laws and increased prison sentences across the board. And that is just not a direction that we can afford for our state to go. So a couple graphics from our partners at FAM that does a lot of this work on a national level, kind of comparing myths and facts around mandatory minimums. So common myth, misconception about mandatory minimums is that repealing them would eliminate punishment, that people would not be held accountable. But we know that repealing these types of mandatory sentences, in fact, would restore discretion to judges and to juries so they can decide appropriate punishments instead of applying one-size-fits-all sentences. Without mandatory minimums, people will not be deterred from committing crimes. This is, I would say, like one of the biggest myths that we hear around mandatory minimums and harsh sentences in general is the idea that they're an effective deterrence method and that people are going to be deterred from crime because of harsh sentences. But the reality is that people are not aware of mandatory penalties when they commit a crime. Believe it or not, most people do not go look in the Missouri Revisor of Statutes and figure out exactly how much time is associated with something before committing a crime. When it comes to, what does actually deter crime, being caught and being punished quickly is what is effective deterrence, not lengthy sentences. And in Missouri, the crime clearance rates for violent crimes are very low. I think it was 2022, only 64% of violent crimes that were reported to police were not solved. And so focusing, instead on some of those areas that we know to be more effective for crime deterrence rather than sending people to prison for longer is an important strategy. Next slide, Lucas. Another common myth is that mandatory minimums create consistency in sentencing. But in reality, prosecutors use mandatory minimums at different rates from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, creating sentencing disparities and irregularities. Excuse me. So, for example, a prosecutor might be aware that this particular charge carries a mandatory minimum, whereas this particular charge does not. And so they might be more incentivized to use the charge that carries a mandatory minimum penalty. Studies show very clearly that prosecutors are more likely to charge Black defendants with offenses that carry mandatory minimums, perpetuating that racial disparity that we see in Missouri prisons, which again shows that Black Missourians are incarcerated at a rate of over 3 times that to white residents in the state. Next slide, please, Lucas. A couple other kind of myths and facts to talk about. So, crime is kind of, one of those political evergreen issues. I think it is always popular to talk about crime and public safety. The reality right now is that crime rates are down. They're down significantly, but the perception of the public is really what matters here. There's a really in-depth analysis that just came out with some recent crime data from the Council on Criminal Justice, showing that the national arrest rate in 2024 was 30% lower than in 2019. So we're seeing really big reductions just in the last couple of years. Gallup surveys showed that for surveys conducted all the way back to 1993, the vast majority of these surveys, at least 60% of U.S. adults have said that there was more crime nationally than in the previous year, despite a downward trend in crime rates during that time. So folks are saying, I believe that crime is going up. Crime is actually going down. But what people believe at the end of the day is more important to politicians than what is actually happening. Media coverage plays into this heavily. If you watch, your local news, you're probably going to see a lot of crime coverage. Um, it is, one of the most popular things for local reporters to be covering. It's sensational. It makes people turn in, but then it also gives this false sense that crime rates are higher than they've ever been, or rising, or more of a problem than ever before. Whereas the reality, when we dig into the crime rates, actually paints a very different picture. This all kind of creates a feedback loop. Constituents are putting pressure on their elected officials to act on the perceived increases in crime rather than the reality, which is a reduction in crime. And that gets us to a place where we are talking about mandatory minimum policies in 2026. Next slide, please, Lucas. This is just a nice graphic from Prison Policy Initiative that shows the decline in crime rates over the last 10 years. Next slide. A couple facts straight from the Department of Corrections that I think are also very helpful to understand. Um, Incarcerated people are not serving less time now than they have previously. A lot of the proponents of the current legislation to increase prison sentences has said that the prison is a revolving door. Folks are barely serving any time on their sentences and then going right back out into the community to commit more crimes. The fact is that people that commit violent crimes in the state of Missouri are already serving a very substantial portion of their sentence before returning to the community. DOC data from last year shows that the average person sentenced for a Class A, B, or C violent felony is serving over 80% of their sentence prior to release, and that the average time spent in prison for those offenses increased from 9.7 years about 10 years ago, fiscal year 16, to 11.4 years last year. And then during the same period, that percentage of time served for Class D or E violent felonies, so these are lower level violent felonies, increased from 51 to 58%. Next slide, please. A lot of the conversation that I've heard in some of these hearings seems to be more about folks that are convicted of nonviolent offenses and people that are cycling in and out. That might be more related to drug addiction and mental health challenges. People that have been convicted of these nonviolent crimes are not serving any shorter sentences than they did in previous years. The percentage of time served on A, B, and C nonviolent and drug felonies has stayed pretty much the same from fiscal year 16 to fiscal year 25, from 36% to 38%. And for D and E, nonviolent drug felonies, that percentage of sentence served has remained at 34%. So again, the perception that people are serving less time now than before is just not accurate. There's a lot that can be learned from other states. Lawmakers across the country and across the political spectrum have shown us that states can successfully reform their sentencing laws and reduce crime and incarceration by doing so. Over 30 states have reformed or repealed mandatory minimum sentences in the past 2 decades. Louisiana in 2017 repealed many of its mandatory minimums, and in those first 6 months after repeal, the state saved $12 million. The prison population dropped to a level not seen since the 90s, and they've been able to reinvest those savings into crime reduction and victim support programs. In 2015, Pennsylvania, their many mandatory minimum sentences were struck down as unconstitutional. Crime rates have been on the decline since 2015 in that state. And in 2002, in Michigan, lawmakers repealed almost all of the mandatory drug sentences. The state's crime rate has dropped 27% in the decade that followed. Next slide, please. Looking at the other side of things, states that have really dug in on truth in sentencing laws have seen really negative results. Wisconsin had a 14% growth in the prison population and a severe programming shortage after passing truth in sentencing laws. Georgia's seen really dangerous environments within prisons that have led to more crime committed upon reentry and significantly higher reincarceration rates. And in Arizona, excuse me, in Arizona, after passing similar legislation, they saw a 50% increase in rules infractions, 20% reduction in educational programming enrollment, and a higher rate of reincarceration. Next slide, please. Sorry, folks, my cough has not been bothering me all morning. Of course, it was waiting until I had 30 minutes of nonstop talking to really flare up. Okay, so there have been a number of bills filed this year that would increase prison populations and increase prison sentences here in Missouri. These three bills on the House side have all already seen some movement. House Bill 2637 from Representative Black and House Bill 2256 from Representative Hovis were both heard last week in the House Corrections. I'm sorry, that should say House Judiciary Committee. I will amend that in the slides. Representative Black's bill, which is identical language to a couple of bills on the Senate side that were shouted out in Governor Kehoe's State of the State address, indicating that this is a top priority for the governor. These bills reflect changes to the sentencing structure that the Missouri Sentencing Advisory Committee put forward. So I think, the sheriffs, the prosecutors, all have been talking to one another and making recommendations. And the changes to how Missouri sentencing would be done in this bill is pretty profound. So right now, again, there's not a minimum percentage for sentences across all classes. You have to be a prior offender, have a prior prison commitment, be a persistent or a dangerous offender, or be convicted of a dangerous felony for a minimum prison term to apply to you. Minimum prison terms are not something that applies to 100% of individuals in Missouri prisons as it stands now. This would change that entirely and set minimum percentages across every class. So Class A felonies would need to serve 60 to 80% before being released eligible, 40 to 60% for Class B felonies, 30 to 50% for Class C felonies, 17 to 37% for Class D and E felonies. And another big change that would be made here is that the shock treatment, like 120 days in Missouri Department of Corrections, right now, that does not count as a prior prison commitment. That is something that folks do for like substance abuse treatment, that this would add that to the prior prison commitment calculation. It would also add several offenses to the dangerous felony category. Again, this was heard not in House Corrections, but in House Judiciary. You can read our testimony linked on our website. House Bill 3155 from Representative Benny Cook, almost identical to Representative Black's bill. This bill is going to be heard tomorrow in Judiciary. Representative Barry Hovis has filed a version of this bill for the past several years. House Bill 2256 would change the sentencing structure so that it's rather than a previous prison commitment, anybody with a previous felony conviction would be subject to that minimum term structure. The fiscal note on this one is really enormous. The fiscal note indicated that up to 5 new prisons would need to be built were this bill to pass. So just that one, on the cuff seems like, oh, that's not a huge change, but the actual impact would be really significant. On the Senate side of things, next slide, Lucas, thank you. there is a trio of bills from Senators Carter, Trent, and Nicola that mirror that language from Black's bill and mirror the recommendations from the Sentencing Advisory Commission. Um, the possibility of parole also has been removed for a certain set of offenses, including armed criminal action, unlawful use of a weapon, both very common charges if a gun is used at all in the commission of a crime. Um, I think that again, Governor Kehoe specifically shouted these out. We've seen an early hearing on the House side for Black and now Cook's bills that reflect those changes as well. And the fiscal note on these bills is very interesting to me. It's written to be very neutral and does not show a very big increase in the prison population because they say this is roughly what people are serving already. But I think baking those percentages in to statute can only be detrimental. There were a lot of assumptions, I think, made in the fiscal impact statement that advocates believe to be not necessarily accurate. A couple other bills, real quick to mention. Senator Schroer's bill, 1437 would increase all classes of sentencing ranges, and also has some language that prosecutors and judges would have to follow any sentencing enhancements to the fullest, with punishments for prosecutors or judges that do not follow those sentencing enhancements. And then finally, Senate Bill 1074 from Senator Brad Hudson would repeal earned and good time statutes for incarcerated people and those on probation and parole. I'm going to turn it over to Lucas for this next slide.
Yeah, thanks, Gwen. So chance to hear from all of us, and I'm going to switch slides in a moment. And Sarah will put a link in the chat. All these bills are going to increase sentences. We heard at least Representative Hovis's bill might be 5 prisons need to be built. We know that the cost, if they were to build a prison now, is $825 million. And so one of the ways to think about not just the fact that this isn't going to do anything to reduce crime is it's also going to spend a lot of money to not reduce crime in any way. And so I'd like you to either follow the link in the chat or scan the QR code and think about if you had that amount of money, what would you spend it on? What do your communities need? What do you think the best use of that fund is? And we're going to put together a little word cloud before we hear from Matthew Charles in a moment. So let me switch over to the word cloud as you all put your answers in. Right. So see housing, encourage folks to come to our affordable housing focused session tomorrow. You see affordable housing. I prompted it correctly. Childcare, health treatment, Medicaid. I'm sure you've heard, just the news today, there's proposals to cut, I think, some healthcare funding for people with intellectual disabilities because we can't afford that in the budget right now. I know folks think about reentry, job training, sorts of programs we know that invest in people and communities that also, in the long run, can reduce crime while improving lives. Wastewater treatment, parks. All right, I'll keep it open for just a few more seconds before we turn it over. But that, I mean, over $800 million of money to any of those is a pretty significant amount of money. And again, depending on, that's just the cost of the prison. That's not even the increased cost of the correction system. That's just the building of the prison. So that's undercounting the amount of money that it'll cost to implement these increased sentences. Any other ones that I should call? I didn't mention child care, but as a parent, I feel like I'm obligated to mention education and child care as well, which are also great programs that states should be investing in more as well. All right, well, thanks for keep putting your entries in. We might revisit this towards the end of our presentation, but I'm going to pass it back to Gwen, I think, to pass it back to Matthew Charles from FAM.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Lucas, and thank you everybody for sharing your ideas. I think that it's so important to keep what we do envision for our state at the forefront of our conversations and of our talks with lawmakers when we're talking about why we don't want to double down on regressive sentencing policy. Every dollar spent towards corrections is a dollar that could be spent on an upstream solution instead, or elsewhere in our communities. I am really excited to turn it over to my colleague Matthew Charles, an advocate at FAM. Matthew Charles was arrested in 1995 and was sentenced to a 35-year federal sentence at 85% for nonviolent offenses. This very insane sentence length was the result of the disparity between crack cocaine and powder cocaine, which we've talked about and has recently been changed in Missouri. After serving 22 years on that sentence, he became the first person released because of the First Step Act that was signed into law in 2018 by President Trump, and attended the State of the Union shortly after his release. Matthew's been an advocate with FAM for criminal justice reform since being released, speaking with the president and nationally with governors, lawmakers, college students, and churches about the need for sentencing and prison reform, the harms of mass incarceration in America. Matthews testified multiple times before the U.S. Senate and several state legislatures, and has received the Excellency in Advocacy Award from the Coalition for Public Safety. So without further ado, Matthew, I turn it over to you.
Good afternoon. As Gwen has stated, I received a 35-year federal sentence in 1996. And during that time, I didn't understand about the disparity between crack cocaine and powder cocaine. And I also didn't understand mandatory sentences. So I threw that out there to say that the belief that a mandatory minimum would deter somebody from committing a crime is just foolishness altogether, because no one thinks that they're actually going to be caught for the crime, and no one actually thinks about weighing the sentence, what it may be if they are caught for that crime. But in 1996, I was sentenced to a 35-year sentence. While incarcerated, I was able to see and understand the difference between mandatory sentences and sentences that weren't mandatory sentences. And as Gwen has stated, I work for the organization FAM. FAM's acronym stands for Families Against Mandatory Minimums. It was established in 1991 by Julie Stewart. At that time, Julie Stewart's brother, who lived in Washington State, was arrested for growing marijuana plants. And at that time, he didn't have any criminal record whatsoever, but he received a 5-year mandatory minimum sentence. And at his sentencing, the judge stated that the sentence was too harsh, but he was bound by the terms of the mandatory minimum to sentence him to 5 years. Well, this moved Julie enough for her to actually start the organization FAM. So here we are 35 years later, still fighting mandatory minimum sentences, which is kind of ridiculous. But also, as Gwen stated, whenever she was speaking, a lot of politicians and a lot of just regular citizens believe that a mandatory minimum will deter crime. They do believe that giving people longer sentences adds to public safety, but the data contradicts that. There's very little to no evidence that it does any of those things. And there is evidence to support that it does more than that. But during that time that I was actually serving, I was able to work in the law library. And by doing so, I was able to look at the cases of many of those that were incarcerated with me. And I seen the difference in their sentences because of the mandatory minimums. And I was thankfully released in January of 2019 because the First Step Act was signed. The part that allowed me to be released on that First Step Act didn't have anything to do with the mandatory minimums or the rehabilitative programs that were now going to be instituted in federal prison. But it made retroactive a 2010 law passed by President Obama, which lowered the crack cocaine disparity between powder cocaine from 100 to 1 to 18 to 1. And President Trump allowed that to be in his First Step Act, making it retroactive. So that is the line or the key that actually set me free. But also that First Step Act, it did address some mandatory minimums. It actually changed the person that received a first time well, not a first time, but a drug offense and had one prior offense from serving 20 years to 15 years. It also allowed those who were serving life sentences, they would no longer receive life for having two or more priors. It would now be 25 years. And the importance or significance of that is in federal prison, life is life. You don't have a release date. It's till you expire. So therefore, that changed to 25 years. It also did away with the mandatory stacking for the 924 cases, where sentences were built up upon one another to a point to where somebody can have 200 years for just that one offense and the gun stacking. So it did address mandatory minimums in some aspect. What FAM actually does, FAM looks to eliminate or reduce the mandatory minimum time that a lot of states are given for mandatory minimum sentences. And in doing so, we have been able to dispute or show legislators where there is more benefit, as we stated a little bit before I was introduced, there's more better benefit of using that money in the communities or giving it to law enforcement as a tool so that they can either hire more detectives, clear some of the cold cases, test some of the DNA because there's a backlog on it. So there's a whole lot better ways to protect public and utilizing that money than spending it to give somebody 1 year more, 10 years more on an increased sentence that's going to cost anywhere from $30,000 to $40,000 for that one individual. As Gwen also stated, we also know that prisoners that age in prison have more medical problems, so that's going to be a more increased medical cost for that one individual. So once I was released, I was able to attend the State of the Union. And because I happened to be released by President Trump, it opened the door for me to go around and speak with governors in a bunch of states, some of those states that were actually working on mandatory minimums at that time. I was able to come to the state of Missouri in 2019, and I think it was Representative DeGroot and Representative I want to say Shamad Dogan, they actually had a First Step Act bill of 2019 that was actually passed and signed by Governor Parsons. So I was able to come to Missouri at that time and speak with legislators, share my experience, share my story, talk about the need for sentencing and prison reform, talk about how my sentence allowed me to be not just as far as having the crack cocaine sentence versus the powder cocaine sentence that allowed me to have a 20-year longer sentence, but the fact that it allowed me to have a mandatory minimum sentence to where rehabilitation was no longer a focal point of incarceration. It was just about incapacitation and punitiveness. And therefore, I was hopeful that the First Step Act will put the focus back on rehabilitation. But we all know that politicians love to use the hype that crime has been risen. We were able to see that crime has fallen in the state of Missouri. As stated, there are several different mandatory minimum bills being proposed in the state of Missouri. The ones that we're actually watching the closest happen to be HB 2637 and HB 2256, which is by Representative Hovis and Representative Black. While I was down there, I was able to have meetings with Representative Hovis as well as Representative Betty Cook in their office concerning the bills and the things that they were wanting to see done. And their whole thing was they believed that they were repetitively seeing some of the people that were being incarcerated and released. And as stated in some of the testimony that was given at the hearing while I was there, it's not so much as a failure on the individual who gets out and become a recidivist. It's also a failure on the state to take full advantage in seeing the rehabilitation or that incentives are available for that individual to be able to change. While I was incarcerated, I became a Christian. I worked in the law library. I was an educational tutor. I was able to successfully see people come all the way from, sad to say, a sixth grade educational level to receiving their GED through some of the classes that were taught there and the tutoring that were done by myself and other prisoners at that institution. And so therefore, once I was released, I was able to hit the ground running. I had a mission, I had a purpose. I believe that people deserve to be out and be free. And sadly to say, I believe that I benefited when some others before me who had been in before me should have been given the opportunity to be set free. So I'm always mindful of those men. I know it's women incarcerated as well, but I was in the men's prison. So I'm always mindful of those men that I left behind that want me to be able to help them to the best of my ability, just like I tried to do when I was in the law library, looking at their case, reading over their case, researching things, filing petitions on their behalf. So now that I have the opportunity to speak with governors or legislators about these sentences that are long, that are definitely unnecessary. You've heard Gwen express earlier all the different reasons why mandatory minimums are unnecessary. First, it takes complete discretion from the judge. It gives the prosecutors more power and authority, sometimes to the point of them being able to charge you with a mandatory minimum to force you to plea or to force you to become a snitch. At any time that the prosecutor has more power in the courtroom than the judge, then the prosecutor actually becomes the judge. But because these mandatory minimums exist, it does allow the prosecutor to have that authority. It does cause more people to plea out so that they won't be hit with a mandatory minimum. At the same token, it also allows the judge to go on record, as was stated with Julie Stewart, the founder of FAM, to go on record and say, I don't like the sentence, but I have to impose the sentence. And hopefully that language, because sometimes we utilize that whenever we're speaking with legislators, how judges have stated, I've looked at this man's case, I've looked at the crime that he's committed, I've looked at the extenuating factors or mitigating factors, such as if this person was addicted, such as the mental health of this person, such as why this crime was committed by this individual, and I'm unable to do anything besides impose this long sentence because my hands are bound. And in the state of Tennessee, let me give you one example. In the state of Tennessee, we were able to repeal, well, we didn't repeal, we had changed the drug-free school zone law. In the state of Tennessee, the drug-free school zone law stated that if you sold drugs within 1,000 feet of a school, a church, a park, a community center, then you were able to get an enhanced sentence. And some of those enhancements took people to 15 to 25 years. But we were able to show that being smart on crime is to reduce the distance between that school, drug-free school zone from those things will be 500 feet and not 1,000 feet. But also, look at the time that the person was arrested. Some of those people were arrested at midnight or 2 in the morning, and school was not taking place at that time. Some of those people actually lived in a community where a school or a church was and got caught at their own house. So there was no vulnerable people such as elders or children that were involved. So we were able to speak with legislators, and they were able to file the motion. Well, not filed the motion, filed the bill, and actually successfully passed that bill. I always remember when I went in and spoke with Senator Mike Bell, who filed the bill on the Senate side. He said, you know what? He said, I know someone who was lured into a drug-free school zone just so they can have that enhancement. He said, so I'm very familiar for what you're saying, and I'm on board with it. And that's the reason he was able to file it in the Senate. So that bill actually passed. And once it passed 2 years later, we came back begging, asking them to make it retroactive for those that are already incarcerated so that they will be able to also benefit from it, because it's normally those people that are incarcerated, like myself, that we utilize their stories whenever we speak with legislators on why something needs to be changed or why something needs to be repealed, and to see those people whose lives that we use or stories that we use still behind bars after it's changed. Now, don't get me wrong, we love a bill that goes prospectively. We want it to stop right then, and we want the practice to stop, and we want those that are currently coming in not to be sentenced the way those that are in were sentenced. But also, we also want to reach back and make sure this bill is able to apply to those that have already been sentenced that way, because the harm for them is still intact. It's not undone until something is made retroactive that benefits them and allows them to be released from you know, the chains of imprisonment as well. So we were able to successfully pass that in 2020. And then in 2022, as I stated, we came back and was successful in seeing it made retroactive. But oftentimes, whenever we speak about these mandatory minimum bills, just as Gwen stated, just as the gentleman stated, the cost of these bills. If you turn around and say that the physical cost is neutral, we know that's a lie. We know keeping somebody in prison for a year more, months more, costs money. So therefore, there's always going to be a physical impact. We was able to defeat a three strikes bill in the state of Tennessee, and also able to see the bills last year that were mandatory minimum bills in the state of Missouri fail because of the costs associated with the bill. And the state of Missouri states that they want to keep a tight budget, but yet at the same token, we understand that the governor wants HB 2637 and the reasoning behind it. But we also know that it still comes at a cost. But HB 2256 will be a complete waste of the state of Missouri's money. HB 3155, hopefully it does correlate to HB 2637. But at the same token, we don't like some of the things that are in HB 2637 because, as I stated, the organization that I work for, one of its cornerstones is fighting against mandatory minimums or increasing someone's sentence. Because we believe that if you give a mandatory minimum, which is a floor that everyone starts at, and yet it doesn't have a ceiling, you can give someone whatever sentence you want on the top end, but not go below the mandatory minimum unless a safety valve exists, then that's unfair. And that's not individualized sentencing. So a lot of the things that FAM has been able to point out is the fact that it takes the discretion away from the judge. It doesn't deter crime. It doesn't promote public safety. They are very costly with little to no investment to the state or the taxpayers that are paying for this. And there can be a better way to utilize the taxpayers' money to solve crimes. As Gwen so stated and as FAM has stated on that one flyer, is we believe in swift arrests and holding a person accountable. That is the way to protect the public safety as opposed to giving them long sentences to where they're still incarcerated, held bound until a date, whether they rehabilitate themselves or change or not.
Thank you so much, Matthew. I have learned a lot working alongside you the last couple years, and it's always awesome to see you testifying before committees here in Missouri and doing your thing. And so, yeah, really appreciate you sharing some insights with the group today. If folks could just take a quick moment and complete this call to action. You can scan this link. Scan this QR, or there will be a link in the chat in just one moment. You can take action by letting Missouri lawmakers in the House Judiciary Committee know that you oppose the bills that are put forward before them right now. The Black's bill that we mentioned will be in executive session tomorrow. So you can take a moment to do this very quick call to action. Put a thumbs up emoji in the chat when you are finished. And thank you all for joining us for this call today. I hope everybody has learned something new or is coming away with some new food for thought.
And if you do want to, we have the form email. If you do want to customize it, I'd encourage you to add in a sentence about what you'd rather see them spend the money on. I know many of you had great ideas. Maybe you want to steal some ideas or combine some of the ideas, housing and childcare. But I think it's great. Gwen talked about earlier about how because of the perceptions of crime, politicians often hear about we want more of this. This is an opportunity to say, no, we don't want more money going towards prisons. We want more money going to childcare, housing, reentry services, healthcare, parks, all of those great ideas. So if you have a second, as you go to that link, there's an opportunity to put that either the top, bottom, wherever you want to insert it into the email to legislators to say that you're opposing this and you think better use of funds is to support childcare or whatever the case may be. That would be great too.
Seeing lots of thumbs up. Excellent. Um, just so we get everybody out of here at 1, Lucas, could you go on to the next slide? And if you guys are wrapping up your CTA, that is no problem at all. I do want to end on a positive note, calling out a couple of the bills this year that would move the needle in a different direction. These good time bills were heard last week in House Corrections. Good time bills would they essentially give folks time off of a sentence for good behavior or for earned time. It's like credit for completion of educational or restorative justice programs. Those bill numbers are outlined there, and we will be watching those very closely, particularly House Bill 2751 from Representative Perkins, which also has language that would end the ban on folks with drug felonies being able to access SNAP benefits. There's a survivor's justice bill from Representative Rauter. This would allow for judicial resentencing for folks whose offenses stemmed from abuse. So think somebody, kills or assaults someone that they have been the victim of abuse for many years. This would allow that person to be resentenced. There's a couple good parole bills from Senate Democrats that are linked there. And then again on the House side from Representative Sassman, a bill that would include 19-year-olds in second look sentencing after serving 25 years or more. And Lucas, I believe you're gonna close us out. Thank you all so much. And the one thing that I neglected to mention, but our Community Justice Coalition meets twice a month. I will drop the info about signing up for that in the chat. If you're not already a member of the CJC, we would love to have you.
Yeah, and if you're interested in doing more, appreciate everything we can do in this day and age over the internet and virtually. But if you're interested in going to the Capitol and getting a chance to meet with legislators, rallying with other advocates, and particularly if you're new to Capitol advocacy, this is a great day to come. We'll all of Empower Missouri's policy staff will be taking groups around to meet with legislators to talk about community justice issues, food security issues, and affordable housing issues. So please register. Sarah put that in the chat. Please register and love to see you in person on February 17th. And with that, thank you all. A reminder, our last week of action event is tomorrow at noon around affordable housing. Hope to see many of you all there, and have a great rest of your day.